In 1894, the United States Census Bureau sat down to do something that, well, it seems almost impossible in retrospect.
Oh, completely impossible.
Right. They attempted to mathematically quantify the human cost of the American Indian Wars. They pored over all these military records,
Yeah.
field reports, demographic estimate.
Trying to tally up the death toll.
Exactly. Of what most people assumed was just a tragic, chaotic chapter of frontier expansion. But what they found, what the data actually showed, it completely shattered the standard narrative.
Because they didn't find one war.
No. They found a staggering, overlapping web of over 40 distinct military conflicts.
Yeah, over 40.
And these conflicts didn't just span a few bad years, or a single presidency. They spanned an unimaginable 300 years.
3 centuries of virtually continuous compounding collision. I mean, it is a scope that completely defies how we are usually taught to think about history.
Right, we like our history neat.
Yeah, neatly packaged, a clear start date, a defined battlefield, a surrender, and a treaty that wraps it all up. But this is the absolute definition of a generational systemic upheaval.
It really is.
You're talking about conflicts that predate the existence of the United States by over a century and a half, and they continue well past the Industrial Revolution, right up to the dawn of the 20th century.
Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you're here with us. Today, our mission is unpacking an incredibly extensive compilation of historical sources. We're primarily drawing from a massively detailed curation of texts covering this exact 300-year span of the American Indian Wars.
But a lot of ground to cover.
It's a massive amount of ground, and because the sheer gravity and complexity of this topic can easily become overwhelming, we are establishing a strict rule for our conversation today.
A structural rule.
Yeah. We're going to structure this discussion chronologically. We're going to walk through this timeline step by step, starting from the earliest colonial settlements in 1609 and moving forward to the closing of the frontier.
And I think it is vital that we look at this objectively. We are going to be exploring some incredibly heavy history here, a massively complex web of land disputes, shifting alliances, broken treaties, and evolving government policies.
Yeah, and we want to be clear about our approach.
Exactly. Our goal here isn't to endorse any specific political viewpoint or, cast modern moral judgments on 17th century actors. We want to look closely at the mechanics of history. We want to understand how and why these 3 centuries unfolded the way they did without flinching from the harsh realities documented in our sources.
Okay, let's unpack this because starting in 1609 requires completely recalibrating how we think about the North American continent.
It really does.
I mean, I always pictured a sort of Thanksgiving scenario. Small bands of settlers arriving, meeting local tribes, and eventually, inevitably, clashing over farmland. But the source material paints a completely different picture.
The radically different picture.
We are looking at the arrival of multiple, highly competitive European colonial empires all at once. The English, the Spanish, the French, the Russians, the Dutch. Right. And the native tribes aren't just sitting there waiting to be displaced. They are suddenly thrust into this entirely new, unprecedented global economy.
What's fascinating here is how quickly the popular misconception of Native Americans as passive victims falls apart when you look at the primary sources.
Yeah.
These early conflicts were deeply, intricately entangled with European rivalries. The tribes were highly active, deeply pragmatic geopolitical players.
Yeah.
Take the Beaver Wars, for example.
Okay, the Beaver Wars.
Yeah, this wasn't a brief skirmish. The Beaver Wars ran from roughly 1609 all the way to 1701.
Wow.
Almost a century of warfare driven fundamentally by the introduction of a new, globalized market, the fur trade.
Wait, I need to stop you there because the Beaver Wars sounds almost trivial to a modern ear. Why on earth were nations fighting a century-long war over a semi-aquatic rodent?
It comes down to European fashion, believe it or not. Yeah, and the introduction of advanced military technology.
Yeah.
In Europe, felt hats made from beaver pelts were a massive status symbol. But the European beaver had been hunted almost to extinction.
Oh, I see.
Suddenly, North America is discovered to be teeming with them. The French, Dutch, and English want these pelts desperately. But they don't know the land, and they don't have the manpower to hunt them, so they turn to the native tribes.
Makes sense.
But they don't just trade beads or blankets. They trade matchlock and flintlock muskets.
Ah, and that completely breaks the existing balance of power.
Completely.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine you are the Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York. You begin trading with the Dutch and later the English, acquiring firearms in exchange for beaver pelts.
Right.
Suddenly, you have a massive military advantage over your traditional indigenous rivals like the Huron or the Algonquians who were allied with the French. But here's the trap. Firearms require gunpowder and lead shot.
Which you cannot manufacture yourself.
Exactly. You can only get them from the Europeans, and the Europeans only want beaver pelts.
So it's a vicious, inescapable feedback loop. You need to hunt more beavers to trade for more guns so you can defend your hunting grounds from rival tribes who are also trying to get more guns.
That's it, exactly.
And when you overhunt your own territory, you have to use those guns to aggressively expand into your neighbor's territory to find more beavers. It's an arms race fueled entirely by a luxury fashion commodity.
It was an arms race that fundamentally redrew the map of the Northeast and the Great Lakes. The Iroquois pushed as far west as the Mississippi River, displacing dozens of other tribes, purely to monopolize the fur trade.
That's wild.
And throughout all of this, the tribes were constantly playing the European powers against one another.
Killing them off each other.
Yeah. If the French offered a better rate of exchange for pelts or, more reliable muskets, an entire tribal alliance might pivot overnight.
It's like a massive geopolitical chessboard. But the pieces on the board are actively negotiating their own moves and threatening to switch sides if the players don't offer a better deal.
That's a great way to put it.
But it makes me wonder, if trade and economics were the primary drivers, was massive systemic violence inevitable? Or did it depend entirely on the specific policies of the Europeans who showed up?
Well, it absolutely depended on policy. The European approach to native populations was not a monolith. The sources highlight an incredible contrast that proves conflict was a choice, not an inevitable law of nature.
Okay, let's hear it.
On one extreme, look at the Russian colonization of Alaska.
Right, the sea otter pelts.
Yes. The Russians were after sea otter pelts, and their methodology was largely brute force. In August of 1784, Russian colonists descended on Sitkalidak Island and perpetrated what is known as the Owak Massacre.
A massacre?
Yeah, they slaughtered somewhere between 200 and 3,000 Koniag-Alutiiq tribesmen. It was an overwhelming, terrifying display of violence designed to subjugate the local population and force them to hunt for the Russian-American company.
That is just staggering violence, but the sources explicitly contrast that Russian brutality with the approach taken by the Swedes.
Yeah, it's the colony of New Sweden,
Right.
which was established along the Delaware River in the mid-1600s. The historical record shows that most Indian tribes were actually very friendly toward the Swedes. The relationship was incredibly peaceful.
And why was that?
Because the Swedish colonial authorities had a strict, rigorously enforced policy of respecting tribal land boundaries. They didn't push for aggressive unilateral expansion. They engaged purely in mutually beneficial trade and viewed the tribes as sovereign neighbors rather than obstacles to be cleared.
So the violence is directly correlated to the demand for land and the refusal to recognize sovereignty. If you respect the boundary, you get peace.
Precise.
If you demand the land and the labor, you get a massacre. But this fluid, almost chaotic dynamic of the colonial era, this whole system of tribes playing the French against the British, against the Spanish, that entire centuries-old geopolitical machine grinds to a halt in 1775.
It does. When the British colonies decided to rebel and form their own independent nation, the strategic reality for Native Americans shattered overnight.
The balance of power was just gone.
Exactly.
You know, we're taught in school to view the American Revolution strictly through the lens of the colonists.
Right.
Washington crossing the Delaware, the fight against taxation without representation, the birth of democracy. But the source material makes a point that completely reframes this era. It states that the American Revolutionary War was, in reality, two parallel wars happening simultaneously.
It really was. In the East, along the seaboard, it was a political rebellion against British rule.
Right.
But in the West and the backcountry of Pennsylvania, New York, and the Ohio River Valley, it was an all-out Indian war.
Yeah.
The newly proclaimed United States wasn't just fighting for independence. They were fighting the British for physical control of the vast territory stretching to the Mississippi River. And many native tribes looked at the situation and made a highly rational calculation.
They sided with the British.
They sided with the British.
Because the British Empire, for all its faults, had actually tried to limit westward colonial expansion.
Yes, exactly.
The British had drawn the proclamation line of 1763, basically telling the colonists, you cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. But the American patriots were the very settlers actively trying to push into native territory.
Right.
If you're a tribal leader, the patriots are your immediate existential threat.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But choosing a side in this revolution caused devastating internal fractures within native groups. Look at the Iroquois Confederacy.
Oh, this part is just tragic.
It really is. This was an incredibly powerful, sophisticated political and military alliance of 6 nations that had stood together for centuries, and the American Revolution broke them apart.
Wow.
The Oneida and Tuscarora nations decided to ally with the American patriots, while the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga allied with the British.
That is heartbreaking. You have a centuries-old alliance, a brotherhood, essentially forced into a civil war because of a conflict between European colonists.
Yeah.
The sources note they tried desperately to avoid fighting each other, but the brutal reality of the war eventually forced intra-Iroquois combat.
And the ultimate tragedy is what happened when the war ended. When the British negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1783, recognizing American independence, they committed an act of staggering diplomatic betrayal.
Wait, let's talk about this betrayal.
They simply ceded all the land east of the Mississippi to the new United States. They did not consult their native allies. They didn't even mention them in the treaty.
Wait, hold on. The British just signed away land that they didn't even physically occupy?
Yep.
They just drew a line on a map in Paris and handed over millions of acres of sovereign indigenous territory to the Americans?
Yes, they sure did. And as far as the new United States government was concerned, the native tribes who had fought alongside the British were conquered enemy combatants. The American position was essentially, your British allies lost, therefore you lost, and your land is forfeit.
Which is a completely alien legal concept to the tribes because they hadn't been defeated in battle.
Right, not at all.
They were still sitting on their land, heavily armed. And this massive disconnect leads directly into the Northwest Indian War. Settlers start pouring into the Ohio Territory, assuming the land is theirs, and violence instantly erupts.
Immediately.
But I want to be clear here because the sources are very specific. This wasn't just a series of disorganized frontier skirmishes.
No, not at all.
The native tribes responded by forming a massive, highly organized pan-tribal confederacy.
The Western Confederacy. It brought together the Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, the Wyandot, and several
It
others.
was a huge alliance.
Huge. And they were led by some of the most brilliant military tacticians of the era, namely Blue Jacket of the Shawnee and Little Turtle of the Miami. Their objective was simple, and unyielding the Ohio River is the boundary. No American settlement north of the river.
And the United States, which is basically a brand new, nearly bankrupt country at this point, sends the army in to crush them, and the U.S. Army gets absolutely annihilated.
Annihilated is the correct word.
I mean, it's wild.
In 1790, they defeated an army led by General Josiah Harmar. But the true shock came the following year, in 1791. General Arthur St. Clair marched a force of about 1,000 men deep into the Ohio Territory.
And they were waiting for him.
Little Turtle and Blue Jacket were waiting for them near the Wabash River.
Why do we all know about Custer's last stand, but I've never heard of St. Clair's defeat? Was it a cover-up? Because the numbers in the text are wild.
It wasn't a cover-up, but it certainly isn't the romanticized myth that Little Bighorn became. St. Clair's defeat remains, to this day, the most severe loss ever inflicted upon an American army by Native American forces.
The most severe loss.
Yes. Little Turtle orchestrated a masterpiece of tactical encirclement. St. Clair's troops were a mix of poorly trained militia and regular army.
Okay.
The native forces attacked at dawn, moving in crescent formation that perfectly flanked the American camp. They specifically targeted the officers and the artillerymen.
Smart.
Very. Once the officers fell, the militia panicked and ran right through the regular army lines, causing total chaos.
Oh.
Out of roughly 1,000 American soldiers, over 600 were killed and hundreds more wounded. It was a casualty rate of nearly 90%.
A 90% casualty rate. That is catastrophic for a young nation. George Washington was president at the time. He must have been absolutely terrified that the entire western frontier was about to collapse.
Oh, he was furious and terrified, yeah.
Which brings up a really fascinating hypothetical. Given these massive organized victories by leaders like Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, was there a genuine window where a permanent, sovereign, pan-tribal nation could have survived the birth of the U.S.?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer lies, once again, across the Atlantic.
With the British.
With the British. After the Revolution, the British hadn't completely abandoned North America. They still held Canada. And from 1783 all the way to 1812, British merchants and government agents were actively funneling weapons and supplies to the tribes in the Ohio Valley.
So they were still pulling strings.
Exactly. The British government actually had a formal geopolitical strategy to establish a sovereign, internationally recognized Indian buffer state covering what is now Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
To explicitly block the United States from expanding westward and threatening Canada?
Yep.
So yes, there was a window where this pan-tribal nation had the logistical and diplomatic backing of the British Empire. And that window reaches its absolute peak with Tecumseh.
Tecumseh, the legendary Shawnee leader, and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, they realized that localized resistance was doomed.
Right.
Tecumseh traveled tirelessly from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, trying to unite every single tribe into one massive, impenetrable wall of resistance.
A huge undertaking.
And when the War of 1812 broke out between the U.S. and Britain, Tecumseh officially allied his confederacy with the British military.
But this is where that window slams shut, isn't it?
It is. The American forces, commanded by William Henry Harrison, eventually gained the upper hand. Tecumseh is killed in battle in 1813. And when the War of 1812 ends at a stalemate between the U.S. and Britain, the British finally, definitively abandon their plan for that buffer state.
Yeah.
They withdraw their support.
And that is the pivotal turning point.
After 1815, the geopolitical chessboard is gone. There are no more European empires for the tribes to ally with or play against the United States.
All on their own.
The Native Americans are left to face a rapidly industrializing, explosively expanding United States completely alone.
And that isolation triggers a deeply dark shift in federal policy. We aren't talking about border skirmishes anymore. We're talking about the bureaucratic machinery of the state being turned towards systemic, forced expulsion.
Yes.
We are in the 1830s now. Andrew Jackson is in the White House, and he signs the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
It is crucial to look at the legal mechanics of this act, because the popular understanding is often a bit blurry.
How so?
The source material is very explicit. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 did not actually authorize the unilateral abrogation of existing treaties. The president didn't have the legal right to just rip up the contract.
Right.
And it did not legally authorize the military to forcibly relocate tribes at gunpoint. It only authorized the president to negotiate land exchange treaties.
Yet, both the ripping up of treaties and the forced marches at gunpoint occurred on a massive tragic scale anyway.
Yeah, they did.
This is the era of the Trail of Tears. The federal government utilized immense coercion, fraud, and military threat to force the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole off their ancestral lands in the southeast and march them 1,000 miles west to what is now Oklahoma.
It was devastating.
The death toll from disease, exposure, and starvation on those marches was horrific.
But what the sources also detail extensively is that this policy of removal was not met with passive resignation.
No.
It was met with incredibly fierce, protracted military resistance.
Oh.
And nowhere was that resistance more devastating to the U.S. military than in Florida.
The Second Seminole War, I read the numbers on this and I had to double check them. The sources state this was the longest and most costly war the U.S. Army ever waged against Native Americans.
It was.
It lasted from 1835 to 1842. 7 years. Why Florida? Why did the specific conflict drag on so long and cost so much?
Florida had become a unique demographic and geographic haven. It wasn't just native Seminoles living there. For decades, runaway black slaves from plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas had fled south into Spanish Florida. They found refuge, intermarried with the tribes, and formed what became known as the Black Seminoles.
Oh, wow.
The U.S. government and southern plantation owners were terrified of this armed, free black population living just across the border, and they wanted them eliminated or returned to slavery.
Right.
But Seminole leaders like Osceola, McConaughey, and Sam Jones, along with black Seminole leaders like John Horace, had absolutely no intention of leaving or surrendering their allies.
So the U.S. Army marches in expecting a quick campaign, but they are completely unprepared for the tactical reality of the Florida environment.
Completely unprepared.
The Seminoles didn't line up in fields to fight. They used the environment to wage a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. Let's look at the Dade Massacre in December 1835, because logistics of this are terrifying.
Okay, yes. Major Francis L. Dade was ordered to march a column of 110 men to reinforce Fort King. They were marching through the Pine Barrens, a very open, exposed landscape.
Right.
The weather was unusually cold, So the soldiers had their heavy wool coats buttoned up over their ammunition boxes.
Oh, no.
Yeah, making it incredibly difficult to access their powder and shot quickly.
And the Seminole warriors knew this. The sources say they shadowed Dade's column for 5 days.
5 days.
Imagine that psychological pressure. 5 days of marching through the wilderness, knowing you were being watched, waiting for the trap to spring.
And the Seminoles waited for the perfect tactical moment.
When was that?
They waited until the column was strung out along a narrow path, perfectly exposed. When they finally struck, the opening volley decimated the command structure.
Wow.
Major Dade was killed instantly. The soldiers couldn't get to their ammunition because of the coats. They tried to build a small log breastwork, but the Seminole fire was too accurate and too intense.
That is just brutal.
Out of 110 American soldiers, only 3 survived the initial attack, and one of those survivors was hunted down the next day. It was a total, systematic wiping out of a military column.
Total tactical dominance, and it only gets worse for the Army when they try to push deeper into the state. Look at the Battle of Lake Okeechobee in 1837.
Oh, Lake Okeechobee.
Colonel Zachary Taylor, who later becomes president, is marching about 1,000 men into a sawgrass swamp. Let's talk about sawgrass for a second, because I feel like the word grass makes it sound gentle.
It is not gentle.
Sawgrass is essentially an ancient towering reed where the edges of the blades possess serrated silica teeth.
Yeah, exactly.
It is literally like walking through a field of flexible knives. It slices right through cotton clothing and shreds human skin.
And beneath that sawgrass is thigh-deep, thick, sucking mud. Taylor's troops are on foot, completely bogged down. They can't bring wagons, they can't effectively position artillery, and the cavalry is useless.
A nightmare.
It was a nightmare scenario for a conventional 19th century army.
And waiting for them in a hammock of trees surrounded by this horrific terrain are the Seminole leaders, including Alligator and Sam Jones.
Taylor decided to send the Missouri volunteers in first,
Okay.
ordering a direct frontal assault through the mud in the sawgrass. It was a tactical disaster.
I can imagine.
The Seminoles were elevated, firing from the cover of the trees. They opened a devastating volley. The volunteers broke under the fire. Their commander was fatally wounded, and they retreated in panic.
They just broke.
Yeah, they ran. Taylor then sent in the regular army, the 6th Infantry. They suffered horribly. Every single officer in the 6th Infantry, except for one, was killed or wounded.
Good Lord.
The U.S. suffered 26 killed and 112 wounded in that swamp, while the Seminoles, who slipped away into the deeper Everglades, lost only 11 men.
I cannot emphasize enough how terrifying that must have been for the soldiers.
Yeah.
Marching through mud, your skin being sliced open by the grass, water in your boots, humidity off the charts, only to be ambushed by an enemy who is completely invisible until the muzzle flashes start.
It's terrifying.
That makes perfect sense why this dragged on for 7 years.
It comes down to logistics neutralizing technology. The Ohio Valley, where St. Clair fought, was relatively easy for the U.S. military to supply and traverse. But Florida in the 1830s was an untamed, disease-ridden environment that completely negated the conventional military advantages of the United States.
Right.
The Seminoles adapted to a decentralized, highly mobile form of warfare. They lived off the land, striking supply lines and disappearing. The U.S. Army simply wasn't equipped to counter it.
And the disease took a massive toll too, right?
Huge. By 1842, the Army officially recorded almost 1,500 deaths, but the vast majority weren't from bullets. They were from malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery. The military never truly defeated the Seminoles in a traditional surrender scenario.
They just gave up.
The war just sort of exhausted itself. Some Seminoles were eventually captured and migrated west, but a few hundred retreated deep into the Everglades and simply refused to be conquered.
So while the federal government is bogged down in the swamps of the East Coast, spending millions of dollars and losing thousands of men, a completely different paradigm of conflict has been evolving out west.
Yes.
And this conflict isn't centered around the U.S. government. It's centered around a newly independent republic and a native empire that is unlike anything we've discussed so far.
We are shifting our focus to the Republic of Texas and the Great Plains.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources describe Comancheria, the vast territory controlled by the Comanche and their Kiowa and Wichita allies, not just as a tribe, but as a proto-empire.
Right.
And I think we need to define what that means, because they weren't building stone pyramids or capital cities.
No, they built an empire based on kinetic energy and absolute equestrian dominance. Think of the Comanche not as a stationary kingdom, but as a heavily armed, highly mobile corporate monopoly that completely controlled the economy of the southern plains.
Wow.
Their power stemmed entirely from the adoption of the horse.
Which were originally brought over by the Spanish.
Exactly. The Spanish Empire conquered the Aztecs and the Incas relatively quickly. But when they pushed north into what is now Texas and New Mexico, they hit a brick wall. That wall was the Comanche.
Comanche just stopped them.
Stopped them cold.
Oh,
The Comanche acquired Spanish horses, mastered breeding and riding, and weaponized them better than the Spanish ever did.
right.
A Comanche warrior on horseback with a short bow could fire a dozen arrows with lethal accuracy in the time it took a Spanish soldier or a Texas Ranger to reload a single muzzle-loading rifle.
That's a huge tactical advantage.
Huge. They controlled the buffalo hunting grounds, they controlled the trade routes, and they raided deep into Mexico for horses, captives, and plunder. They dictated the terms of survival for everyone else in the region for nearly 70 years.
And this creates massive political whiplash when the Republic of Texas gains independence from Mexico in 1836. Suddenly, Texas is its own nation, and they are sharing a border with this Comanche monopoly.
Yeah.
And you have two Texas presidents who take radically, almost violently different approaches to dealing with this reality. First, you have Sam Houston.
Right. Sam Houston had a very unique background. He had actually run away as a teenager and lived with the Cherokee for years.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he spoke the languages, he understood native diplomacy and the internal politics of the tribes. When he became president of Texas, he actively pursued a policy of engagement, negotiation, and treaties.
Because he knew they couldn't win a straight fight.
Exactly. He recognized that Texas, a brand new republic, did not possess the manpower or the treasury to fight a protracted war against the greatest light cavalry in the world.
But Houston's term ends, and he is succeeded by Mirabeau B. Lamar. And Lamar looks at Houston's diplomacy with absolute disgust. He completely reverses course.
Lamar was an ideological hardliner. He pursued a policy of total deportation and extermination.
Total deportation.
He wanted the Comanche, the Kiowa, and even the peaceful Cherokee who had moved to Texas gone. Period. He refused to negotiate.
Which leads to horrific flashpoints, like the Council House fight in 1840. The Comanche actually came to San Antonio under a white flag of truce for a peace parley.
Right.
They brought captives to trade. But the Texas militia locked the doors of the council house and tried to take the Comanche chiefs hostage. A massive fight broke out, and the militia killed 33 Comanche chiefs and warriors.
Which, in the context of Plains diplomacy, is a profound, unforgivable violation of diplomatic norms.
Right, you don't do that.
You do not kill emissaries under a flag of truce.
Yeah.
The Comanche retaliated with the Great Raid of 1840, driving hundreds of miles to the Texas coast, sacking towns, and taking immense plunder. The violence escalated exponentially.
But let's look at the mechanics of Lamar's hardline stance. I hear people say, well, it was a brutal time. You needed a strong hand to secure the frontier.
Yeah.
Did Lamar's aggressive militarization actually weaken Texas's overall stability compared to Houston's diplomacy? Because the financial numbers in the sources are shocking.
Unquestionably, Lamar weakened Texas. War is incredibly astronomically expensive. You have to pay militias, buy horses, secure gunpowder, and maintain supply lines over massive distances.
Right.
Lamar's ideological drive for removal completely ignored the economic and logistical realities of his young nation. The cost of his Indian Wars ended up exceeding the annual revenue of the Texas government for his entire 4-year term.
It bankrupted them.
He literally bankrupted the republic. The currency collapsed. When Sam Houston returned for his second term as president, the government was so broke, he immediately had to resume diplomacy and sign treaties just to stop the fiscal bleeding.
It's a classic example of ideology blinding leadership to logistics. But the conflict between Texas settlers and the Comanche generated stories that transcend the politics and get right to the human core of this era.
Yes.
The sources highlight the deeply complex, multi-generational saga of the Parker family. It starts in 1836 during the Fort Parker Massacre when a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker is abducted by a Comanche war party.
Now, captive taking was a standard economic and demographic practice for the Comanche. They integrated captives into the tribe to bolster their numbers.
Right.
Cynthia Ann didn't just survive this abduction, she completely assimilated. She forgot her English. She grew up within the tribe, embraced their culture, married a prominent Comanche chief named Pedro Nocona, and had 3 children.
Wow.
For all intents and purposes, she became fully Comanche in her identity and her heart.
But the tragedy of her story is what happens decades later. In 1860, Texas Rangers attack a Comanche camp at the Battle of Pease River. They realize one of the women they've captured has blue eyes. They've recaptured Cynthia Ann Parker, but she didn't want to be recaptured.
No, she didn't.
She was taken back to her white relatives against her will. She was essentially a prisoner in white society, deeply mourning the loss of her Comanche husband and her children, attempting to escape multiple times until she literally starved herself in grief.
It's so sad.
It is a devastating story of a woman torn between two warring worlds.
And the legacy of that tear is embodied in her son, Quanah Parker.
Quanah Parker.
He was not captured at Peace River. He remains with the Comanche. And the son of an abducted Texas settler and a Comanche chief grows up to become one of the most fierce, brilliant, and famous Comanche war chiefs in history.
It's incredible.
He leads the Quahati Band of the Comanche during the Red River War, fighting desperately against the U.S. military at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls.
He is the ultimate synthesis of this frontier collision. But even Quanah Parker, with all his tactical brilliance, cannot defeat the logistical machine of the United States. In 1875, facing the overwhelming force of the federal government, the destruction of their horse herds, and the systemic, deliberate slaughter of the buffalo herds that the Comanche relied on for food, Quanah Parker realizes the era of the equestrian empire is over.
Right.
He surrenders and leads his people to a reservation in Oklahoma, where he incredibly transforms himself again, becoming a wealthy rancher and a pragmatic political advocate for his people.
The Parker family saga is the perfect encapsulation of this era. It's a multi-generational tragedy of two worlds colliding, merging, and ultimately tearing each other apart.
Yeah.
But as Texas was locked in this 40-year struggle with the Comanche, the broader map of the United States was changing at lightning speed. And this is where the sheer volume of westward migration fundamentally breaks whatever existing equilibrium remained in the West.
Which brings us to the Pacific Northwest and the Great Basin, roughly the 1840s to the 1870s. For a long time, the Central Plains were just viewed as a highway to get to the coast. You have the Oregon Trail bringing thousands of wagons full of farmers. You have the Mormon pioneers settling in the Utah Territory to escape religious persecution.
Yes.
And then you have explosive paradigm-shifting events, the gold rushes.
The gold rushes changed everything.
California in 1849, Pikes Peak in Colorado, the gold strikes in Montana and Idaho. Suddenly, regions that had seen very light European presence are flooded with hundreds of thousands of prospectors and settlers overnight.
And this creates immense, immediate pressure on the environment. These settlers required roads, they required massive amounts of timber, they needed food supplies, and they demanded security from the government.
Of course.
The carrying capacity of the land was stretched past the breaking point. This demographic bomb led to officials, like the Washington Territory Governor Isaac Stevens, using highly questionable tactics to clear the land.
The sources mention Stevens specifically. How did he operate?
Stevens essentially used intimidation, coercion, and the threat of military force to compel tribes in the Pacific Northwest to sign treaties,
Right.
ceding massive amounts of prime land in exchange for unrealistically small, resource-poor reservations. He would dictate the terms, often through terrible translations, and demand immediate signatures.
And when you push people onto unlivable land and destroy their traditional salmon fishing or hunting grounds, violence isn't a surprise, it's inevitable.
Exactly.
We see this erupt in the Yakima War and the Puget Sound War. The sources detail the fate of Nisqually Chief Lesky, who was a central figure in resisting Stevens' treaties. The territorial government put him on trial and hanged him for murder in 1858.
Yeah.
But what is absolutely incredible about this specific case is the historical postscript. In 2004, the state of Washington officially convened a historical court and formally exonerated Chief Lesky.
That historical revision is a recurring theme when we look closely at this era. It took almost 150 years for the legal system to admit that Lesky was not a murderer. He was acting as a lawful combatant in a declared war. The initial trial was essentially a judicial assassination to remove a political obstacle.
And the sources detail an even more chilling event just north of the border in British Columbia in 1862. We know disease was a massive factor in the demographic collapse of Native Americans, but usually we think of it as an unintentional tragedy, viruses moving faster than people.
Right.
But this incident in BC was different.
Very different, yes. There was a devastating smallpox epidemic sweeping the Pacific Northwest. But the sources point to a specific incident where workers building a road through Silkwood Territory, without permission, actively and intentionally threatened the native people with smallpox.
They weaponized the disease.
Yeah.
They essentially said, if you stop us from building this road, we will unleash this plague on your villages. And when the Stilcoen fought back against this existential threat in what became the Chilcotin War of 1864, the colonial government lured 6 of their chiefs into a peace parley, arrested them, and hanged them.
Just like Chief Leshy.
And just like Chief Leslie, these chiefs were formally exonerated in 2014 by the British Columbia Premier, who officially acknowledged that there is strong evidence the smallpox was spread intentionally by the colonists.
It demonstrates a horrifying reality of how these lands were taken. The conflicts weren't always formal military cavalry charges. Sometimes the violence was biological,
Right.
sometimes it was judicial, sometimes it was infrastructural. But it was always, fundamentally, about resource extraction, gold, timber, and land.
And that relentless pressure, that closing of the vice from all sides, led to some of the most astonishing military feats in history as tribes tried desperately to escape. In 1877, the Nez Perce tribe in the Pacific Northwest faced the appropriation of their ancestral lands and a sudden gold rush in Idaho.
The Nez Perce War.
The government ordered them onto a fraction of their land. A faction of the tribe refused and decided to flee toward Canada, led by Chief Joseph.
And it is a masterclass in tactical retreat. A band of about 800 Nez Perce, and we must remember this isn't just a military unit. We're talking about 800 men, women, children, and the elderly.
Whole families.
Bringing their entire horse herd with them. They fled for 4 months, covering over 1,200 miles of incredibly rugged, mountainous terrain.
Imagine that logistics problem. Imagine walking from New York to Florida through the Rocky Mountains with your entire extended family, your grandparents, your toddlers, carrying whatever you can hold.
Yeah.
And you aren't just walking, you are constantly fighting off the U.S. cavalry.
Over the course of those 1,200 miles, they engaged 2,000 American soldiers across 18 different engagements, including 4 major pitched battles.
Incredible.
Chief Joseph and his brother Olcott, along with other leaders, utilized brilliant rearguard actions, constantly outmaneuvering a modern, well-supplied, telegraph-connected military force. They finally surrendered just 40 miles short of the Canadian border, pinned down in freezing weather.
I am genuinely curious how this was viewed by the American public at the time, because you have the Telegraph now. Newspapers are reporting on this chase daily. Did the public just see the Nez Perce as an enemy to be crushed? Or did they recognize the sheer, undeniable heroism of what Chief Joseph was doing, trying to protect his families?
It's one of the great paradoxes of the era. Many military officers who fought them and large segments of the American public reading the newspapers greatly admired Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce.
Really?
Yes. They respected their conduct, their refusal to scalp fallen soldiers, and their undeniable tactical genius. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was not known for his gentle views on Native Americans, publicly praised their fighting ability.
Wow.
But here's the tragic reality, that admiration didn't change the policy.
Admiration didn't equate to sovereignty. That is a heavy truth. You can respect the enemy's bravery all you want, but if the federal mandate is to take the land and contain them on a reservation, the machinery of the state is going to grind forward regardless of public sentiment. And while the tribes of the Pacific and the Great Basin were being cornered, the central heart of the country, the Great Plains, was about to become the stage for the final, most infamous clashes of this entire 300-year history.
The closing of the frontier.
We are moving into the 1860s through the 1890s now. And the historical context here is vital. The American Civil War has broken out. The regular U.S. Army troops who had been stationed out west are recalled back east to fight the Confederacy.
Right.
To fill the void, the government authorizes the creation of volunteer militias. And these militias, like the Colorado Volunteers, were composed of local frontier-dwelling men who had a deeply ingrained, extremely hostile settler mentality.
Yes, and that is key.
They weren't professional soldiers following strict rules of engagement. Many of them favored the outright extermination of Native Americans.
This shift in military personnel is crucial to understanding the escalation of atrocities on the plains. When you give military authority to local militias, whose primary goal is land clearance rather than strategic pacification, you remove all restraints.
Yeah.
This dynamic leads directly to horrors like the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864.
The sources are incredibly stark on this event. Let me set the scene neutrally, just reporting the facts from the text. The Colorado Territorial Militia, led by Colonel John Chivington, approached a camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho along Sand Creek.
Right.
This was a peaceful camp. They had been assured protection by the U.S. government. The camp leader, Black Kettle, was actually flying an American flag and a white flag of truce above his lodge.
Yes.
But the militia was operating under orders to take no prisoners. They attacked the sleeping camp. They killed roughly 200 people. And the sources explicitly state that 2/3 of the victims were women and children.
It's horrific.
They mutilated the bodies, took scalps, and paraded the trophies through the streets of Denver. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter.
And the strategic consequence of that massacre was a massive, violent conflagration. It proved to the native tribes that peace treaties and white flags were meaningless.
Why would you ever trust them again?
Exactly. It ignited a fierce retribution, particularly from the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, a highly militarized warrior society.
Yeah.
It essentially set the entire Great Plains on fire.
Right.
You see a similar dynamic in the Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota. That conflict was driven by systematic treaty violations, corrupt Indian agents withholding food, and literal starvation among the Dakota Sioux.
Yeah.
When they finally violently rebelled, the U.S. military response was overwhelming. The conflict ended with the trial and hanging of 38 Dakota Sioux men in Mankato, Minnesota. To this day, that remained the largest penal mass execution in United States history.
I want to pause here for a second because we are wading through some extremely violent, historically charged events, and I want to remind you, the listener, of our mission today.
Good point.
We're looking at these sources to understand the mechanics of what happened. We are neutrally reporting the harsh facts provided in the text without taking political sides because the history itself is heavy enough, and understanding the strategic reality requires us to look at it unflinchingly.
And understanding the evolution of the military strategy is essential. Because after the Civil War ends in 1865, the regular professional U.S. Army returns to the plains.
Right.
And the command eventually falls to figures like General Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman. These are men who had just spent 4 years fighting the bloodiest conflict in American history.
Yeah.
They bring the concept of total war, the strategy of destroying the enemy's economy and infrastructure, which they used to break the Confederacy out to the frontier.
This raises an important question regarding this shift to total war. The sources spent a lot of time detailing Sheridan's specific strategy of winter campaigns.
Yes.
Why winter? From a logistical standpoint, fighting a war in the Dakotas or Montana in the middle of January seems suicidal for an army.
It seems counterintuitive, but it was a cold, calculated, logistical masterstroke.
Also,
Sheridan realized that during the spring and summer, the Plains Indians were practically invincible. They were highly mobile, their horses were strong from grazing on the prairie grass, they had plentiful buffalo to hunt, and they could easily outmaneuver the slow-moving cavalry columns.
okay, sure.
But in the winter, the entire paradigm shifted. The plains freeze, the grass dies, the tribes had to hunker down in sheltered river valleys. Their horses, surviving only on cottonwood bark, became weak and emaciated. They couldn't move their villages quickly.
So Sheridan decides to launch campaigns in the freezing cold. His goal isn't necessarily to engage warriors in open battle. His goal is to destroy their logistics, to burn their food stores, burn their teepees, and destroy their transportation.
Exactly. You don't win against a nomadic cavalry by trying to hold empty territory. You win by destroying their ability to survive the winter.
Wow.
Which is exactly the tactic utilized at the Battle of Washita River in 1868. General George Custer, under Sheridan's command, tracks a Cheyenne camp, ironically, Black Kettle's camp again, through the snow.
Wow, Black Kettle again.
They attack at dawn, they kill an estimated 100 Indians and take 50 prisoners. But the most significant strategic move happens after the shooting stops. Custer orders his men to round up the native horse herd, and they systematically shoot 675 ponies.
They slaughtered the horses.
Yes.
Sheridan's winter campaign strategy seems like the brutal turning point of the entire 300-year history. That was the moment the military realized conventional warfare wouldn't work, so they targeted the fuel of the nomadic culture itself.
Exactly right.
Shooting those 675 ponies wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a calculated logistical strike designed to ensure the survivors could not hunt, could not flee, and would be forced to walk to the reservations to avoid freezing or starving to death.
And this strategy of immense pressure builds toward the crescendo of the Black Hills War in 1876.
The Black Hills War.
The context here is purely economic. Gold is discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Now, this land was profoundly sacred to the Lakota Sioux, and more importantly, it was legally explicitly promised to them in perpetuity by the U.S. government in the Treaty of Fort Laramie.
Right, they had a treaty.
But the government decides they want the gold. So they issue an ultimatum. All Lakota must return to the reservations by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile. The tribes, led by figures like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, refused to abandon their sacred land.
Which leads directly to the most famous, heavily mythologized battle of the entire era, the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Yes.
General George Custer is sent to force them back. He finds a massive encampment of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho along the Little Bighorn River. He splits his forces, completely miscalculates the size of the camp, gets cut off, and his entire command, over 250 men, is annihilated by Native forces.
It is an overwhelming, spectacular Native victory. But from a strategic standpoint, it seals their doom.
Yeah.
The shock of Custer's defeat galvanizes the U.S. government to pour massive resources into the region, relentlessly pursuing the tribes until they are starved into submission.
Right.
What the sources note about the cultural aftermath of Little Bighorn is deeply revealing about how this history was processed and packaged for the American public.
Oh, this detail fascinated me. The Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company actually commissioned lithograph prints of a wildly inaccurate romanticized painting called Custer's Last Fight.
Yeah, they did.
And they distributed these prints to be framed and hung in saloons all across America as an advertising campaign for their beer.
It's a perfect example of immediate industrialized myth-making. The military reality of a devastating, hubristic defeat was instantly transformed into a romanticized, tragic martyrdom.
It's crazy.
It painted Custer as a valiant hero fighting off savages, which served to justify even harsher crackdowns and further land seizures. It shaped the American mythos right there in the local saloon over a pint of beer.
And the final tragic culmination of this era, the event that officially breaks the back of the resistance, happens 14 years later, in 1890. The Wounded Knee Massacre.
Right. To understand Wounded Knee, you have to understand the ghost dance.
Okay, let's talk about that.
By 1890, the Plains tribes are confined to reservations. The buffalo are gone. Disease and starvation are rampant. The culture is collapsing. Out of this despair emerges a religious movement called the Ghost Dance, started by a Paiute prophet named Wovoka.
Okay.
The theological belief was that if the people danced and prayed, the white settlers would disappear, the buffalo would return, and their ancestors would rise from the dead. It was a spiritual movement of profound, desperate hope.
But the U.S. Indian agents in the military see thousands of Native Americans gathering and dancing, and they interpret it as the prelude to a massive armed rebellion.
Exactly.
The military moves in to disarm a Lakota band led by Spotted Elk at Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation. During the disarmament, a scuffle breaks out, a rifle discharges, and the situation instantly devolves into a massacre.
Devastating.
The soldiers, utilizing rapid-fire Hotchkiss mountain guns, pour fire into the camp. They kill up to 300 Lakota, mostly old men, women, and children, fleeing into the snow.
It is widely considered the closing chapter of the major Indian Wars. The resistance was broken. But what the sources highlight is the incredibly harsh, unyielding sentiment of the American public at the time.
Yeah.
They quote a newspaper editorial written mere days after the Wounded Knee Massacre. And the author of this editorial was L. Frank Baum.
The man who would go on to write The Wizard of Oz.
Yes.
The beloved children's author. And what he wrote in 1890 is chilling. He wrote that our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. We had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth.
It's shocking.
The creator of Oz publicly calling for genocide.
It perfectly demonstrates how deeply ingrained the ideology of complete erasure had become in the mainstream American consciousness by the close of the 19th century. The frontier was closed, and the Indian problem, in the eyes of the public, needed to be permanently solved.
I just want to pause and let the gravity of Wounded Knee and that L. Frank Baum editorial settle for a moment. Because to truly grasp the scope of these 3 centuries of conflict, we need to step back from the individual battles and look at the final overarching demographic numbers.
The demographic toll is the true legacy of this era.
The sources provide population estimates, and the drop is mathematically staggering. Prior to European colonization in 1492, estimates for the native population in North America range wildly, but they sit anywhere from 2.1 million to as high as 18 million.
Right.
By the year 1800, shortly after the U.S. became independent and the European diseases had done their worst, that number in the U.S. area was down to roughly 600,000.
And by 1890, the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre, the population had declined to a nadir of about 250,000. From millions down to 600,000, down to 250,000, scattered across isolated reservations.
Let's go back to that U.S. Census Bureau report from 1894 that we opened the show with. They try to quantify the deaths due specifically to warfare over just the 102 years between the signing of the Constitution in 1789 and 1891. They estimated those wars cost the lives of about 19,000 white men, women, and children, and they estimated the lives of about 30,000 Indians, explicitly noting that the actual number of native deaths was likely 50% higher.
And we must remember that is just the death toll from direct military combat over a single century.
Right.
That does not account for the massive compounding mortality from Eurasian diseases like smallpox, cholera, and influenza.
Yeah.
It doesn't account for the deaths from exposure and starvation on forced marches like the Trail of Tears. And it doesn't account for the total systemic disruption of traditional food networks, like the deliberate destruction of the tens of millions of buffalo on the plains.
So what does this all mean? When historians look back at this entire 300-year span today with all this data, how do they categorize it?
That is the core debate of modern historiography on this topic. Historians like Jeffrey Osler, who is cited in the text, argue that these events, when looked at in totality, the military campaigns, the forced removals, the destruction of resources, the deliberate withholding of rations, fit the modern legal definition of genocide.
Okay.
Other scholars debate the terminology, arguing about the specific legal requirement of intent versus the unintended consequences of disease. But what critical thinking requires of us here is looking at those stark numbers and understanding the mechanics.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a series of isolated battles or unfortunate misunderstandings. It was a compounding catastrophe of displacement, warfare, and forced assimilation driven by an insatiable demand for land.
I want you listening right now to reflect on that scale. A population drop from millions down to 250,000 over 3 centuries. Imagine trying to sustain a culture, a language, a family structure through 300 years of continuous geopolitical pressure.
Almost unimaginable.
It was a systemic, relentless machine of expansion that ground down incredibly resilient cultures.
And it is absolutely vital to note that those cultures did survive.
Yes, exactly.
The population reached its lowest point around 1900, but it eventually began to recover and grow throughout the 20th century. The tribes adapted, survived, and persist today. But the physical and political landscape of the continent was permanently, irrevocably altered by those 3 centuries.
Which brings us to the end of our chronological journey today. We have traced a continuous thread of conflict from the early 1600s, where native tribes like the Iroquois played European empires against each other in a massive arms race over the fur trade.
Right.
We watched that geopolitical chessboard fracture during the Revolutionary War, leading to the betrayals of the Treaty of Paris. We waded into the grueling logistics of swamp warfare in Florida, witnessed the 70-year reign of the Comanche Equestrian Empire in Texas, tracked Chief Joseph's agonizing 1,200-mile retreat through the Pacific Northwest, and finally arrived at the tragic, freezing snows of Wounded Knee in 1890.
It is a heavy, deeply complex history. It defies simple narratives of good and evil and instead reveals the brutal pragmatism, the logistical realities, and the devastating human cost of nation building. It is absolutely vital to understanding how the map of North America was actually drawn.
I want to thank you for guiding us through this incredibly dense, difficult material today and helping us break down the actual mechanics of how this history functioned. And to you, listening, the towns you drive through, the highways you commute on, the state borders you cross, they are all directly mapped over the history we discussed today. Every inch of it has a story.
It really does.
This isn't ancient history. It is the foundational bedrock of the modern geography of the United States.
The past is always present in the landscape if you know how to read it.
Exactly. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, something that bridges this 300-year history directly to your life right now. We talked about how the frontier officially closed in 1890, but consider the fact that many of the treaties signed to end the specific conflicts we talked about today. Treaties that were often broken, ignored, or signed under extreme military coercion, like the ones pushed by Isaac Stevens, are still active, legally binding documents under the U.S. Constitution.
Yes, they are.
Today, right this very minute, those exact treaties form the basis of massive ongoing Supreme Court battles over land rights, water rights, hunting access, and tribal sovereignty. The frontier may have closed in 1890, but the legal wars over these exact same territories using the exact same documents are still being fought in courtrooms right now.
The ink on those treaties is very much still wet. The history isn't over.
Something to think about the next time you look at a map or read a Supreme Court headline. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the surface, and keep your curiosity alive. We'll see you next time.